SU carburetors. They are much maligned, just like, you know, many of the things on these British cars. You know, everybody likes to make Lucas wiring jokes. I hate that when they do it, because there's nothing wrong with Lucas wiring. You put a new harness in your car and you set it and forget it. Just put it in, do it once, be done with it, and your Lucas harness is just as good. I'm not a big fan of these advanced auto wire harnesses with the multiple fuses and all that stuff. I know some of you have it. I'm not putting it down. I'm just saying I think it's complete overkill. If you have the products that are on the cars when they were new and they're well maintained, they're just as good as anything else you're going to put on there. I have a 1975 MGB I bought new. I've had it obviously since then. Just completed a 6,000 plus mile trip across country with a Lucas harness, the original Lucas harness with a set of SUs. So as long as you maintain these features on your British car, they're not as bad as some of the jokes tend to make you think. So the SUs are common on British cars, mostly MGs up through 75. The Triumphs had them earlier on in the early to mid 60s, and then they switched to the Zenith Stromberg, which is, you know, very similar in design. I should say that I can't talk about every possible model and variation of these carburetors today. This is going to be just an overview to hopefully give you a better understanding as to how your carburetors work and how you can best recognize when you're having a problem with them, so that so they're not so baffling to people, because I think that's the problem. I mentioned earlier, you know, you bring the car down to the local mechanic because he fixes your Hondas and Toyotas, and you want to have take a look at your car, your MG or Triumph, because it's not running right, and he sees these carburetors and his brain just freezes up because he doesn't recognize it. He doesn't know what it is. So he in desperation gets a Moss catalog and looks through there and says, wow, look at this. I can buy a Weber carb kit and for $500 and my problems are solved. There's nothing particularly wrong with the Weber downdraft, but the reason they're so prolific is because you can do that. You can just pick up a catalog, you buy it, it's in a nice little neat package, it's brand new, and the guy on the corner can understand it because it looks like a Holly that he had on his GTO. So again, there's nothing wrong with them, but I think if you understand these carburetors and go through a little bit more trouble sourcing the things you need, they are what belong on a British car, and they can be well maintained and give you years of satisfactory use. So I can't really go into too much detail on the Zenith Stromberg. The main differences it was designed later in the 60s because of the tightening emission control standards that were put on the British car industry. So they took one design and they kind of, you know, had to modify it and build on it. So there are a lot of little features in here that, quite honestly, I don't understand, and I'm the first to admit it. But in my defense, I always bring this up. In New York is Joe Curto, who is a prolific carb rebuilder. He's been around for decades. He's an expert. He's a character. He's a colorful guy, and he's a friend. And he hates doing the Zenith Strombergs. You know, he just doesn't like doing them. You do them, they don't work right. It's just something he doesn't like getting involved in. So if he doesn't want to do them, then I feel okay saying I don't want to do them either. that's my out. Because if he can't do them, okay. So the Weber kits, many of you have those on your car. As long as we're on the subject of Webers, I'll just say real quick. The Webers are generally the ones that are out there are the 2-barrel 30. They call them 32-36, and they come in water chokes. They come in electric chokes. They come in manual chokes, depending on your preference. Just so you understand how they work, it's a 32 millimeter and a 36 millimeter port. So it's a 2-port carburetor, a 2-barrel carburetor. Those are progressive, so that when you're only working the throttle, you know, just casually driving down the road and not really getting into it, you're opening up the 32 millimeter throttle, the opening. So you're using just 32 millimeters of opening to feed the same 4 cylinders that the SUs are using, 1.5 inches for each carb. So you're less than 50% of the potential intake of air and fuel. Performance is okay, so somehow they managed to maintain the performance all right. Then once you get down on the throttle and push down on it even further, mechanically you open up the second throat, and that's where you start to get into a little bit more power. That's the inherent difference between a Weber and the SUs, and of course I'll get into those. And then the other difference is, for those of you that have Webers, is that there's an accelerator pump in there. So every time you get in the car and you push down on the gas, whether the key's on or the key's in your pocket or key's in the house, it doesn't matter. The car doesn't have to be on. If you push on the gas, you're squirting a little bit of fuel into the throat. So there's nothing wrong with that, but it's easy to flood. It works completely different than the SUs do. They don't have an accelerator pump. You can have your grandkid sit in your car and pretend he's driving all day long. If you got a set of SUs, he can push that gas pedal all day long. You're not flooding it. So the Webers, and I find this particularly on TR6s. The TR6s have a dual Weber conversion setup. You got 2 of them, and the nature of the manifold, I'm not thrilled with it. It dips down and then comes back up, and you got this nice little pocket down there where you can keep all this fuel, so they're real easy to stall. If you don't start your downdraft TR6 the right way, you can flood it pretty easily. But enough about Webers. There are different types of SUs. Over the years they changed the designs. This is an earlier style that would be seen on an MGA. And, to the untrained eye, they look, fairly similar. It's all the same basic idea. And I don't really need to describe the inherent and specific details, but the components are all the same, basically. And that is, when you get right down to it, you've got the body of the carburetor, you've got the float bowl, and then you have the piston and the damper that goes on top, and I'm gonna discuss each of these. So this makes up the 3 basic components. So if you were going to rebuild your SU, you buy a kit from Joe Curto or Moss or wherever you'd like. It comes with many gaskets and seals. It'll come with things that you don't necessarily need, so don't be nervous when you have leftover parts. It comes with a nice little exploded diagram and a list of the parts that you may need. And this happens to be from Joe Curto, British Superior, SU Superior. So if you're going to rebuild it, you're going to break it down into these 3 main components. The later SUs, 71 or 2, they went to a slightly different design. You'll notice this is slightly different in that this is a HIF. These are called HS carburetors, all of them, HS2, HS4, HS6. The number indicates the size of the throat. So HS6s are 1 3/4, HS8s are for JAGs, they're 2 inches, and down the line. So that's the basic idea behind the SUs. The S is for the float bowl being on the side of the carburetor, and that's where the fuel is stored, and I will run through that later. The difference in the later models is that this is an HIF integral float, and the float is stored here at the bottom. The fuel is stored here at the bottom, and there's a float inside there, so it's integrated in a neater package. The advantages to this one are that for whatever reason, the throttle shafts have much less tendency to wear out on these. There's a seal in there, and they don't wear out as much as the earlier cars do. The disadvantage in servicing standpoint is if you want to service these carburetors, they're a lot harder to service on the car because everything's underneath. So if you want to drop this down and gain access to the float or the needle in the seat, it's underneath, and you really can't. So you have to take them off. So it's a little bit more work. The nice thing about the HS series is that with it on the car, you can pretty much do anything without having to take it off, and that's an advantage. So early TR3s, well, MGAs up through TR3s, TR4s, and then actually the TR4s transitioned over to a set of Zenith Strombergs, which are much less involved than the later MGB ones. There's a set on the bench over there. They belong to Bruce Schechter for his GT6. And they're much purer design. Even though they're Zenith Strombergs, they're a much purer design, much more simple and similar to the SUs. All right. Now, the most important thing here about this little discussion, believe it or not, is going to have nothing to do with the carburetor, and that's got to do with the choke. And I know many of you have been around and in the hobby for a very long time, and some of you are new. So for the benefit of those that maybe have trouble with their chokes, this is probably one of the biggest problems we have with carburetors. Forgetting the carburetors, it's the chokes. The choke, when you pull out the choke, it does two things. You pull it out and it mechanically raises, moves a lever, which raises the idle slightly, and then when you continue to pull it even further, it'll enrich the mixture. So it does two things. And unless the choke cable is in tip-top shape and it's tight and it's adjusted, you know, like your old brake cables on your bicycle, they tend to sag after a while. These can do the same. So if you have any play in your choke cable where you can pull it out to any significance and you're really not feeling anything, there's slack in that cable, which means that you're not getting full enrichment when you need to start the car. And I get more calls, you know, guys can't get their cars started, and if they're local, I'll run over there, and you know, sure enough, it's just the choke. It's just not, either they're not pulling it out far enough, or it's just not adjusted right, and it's not enriching the mixture. And unless it enriches it, it's not going to start, particularly if it's cold. So you got a car, it's in the garage, you go out, you pull out the choke, it won't start, it won't start, it won't start. Get somebody in your house, your wife, your child, somebody to come out and pull the choke out for you while you watch the carburetor. And you should see this jet right here being pulled down in one fashion or another. This is an early car. That's the way they go. And then this is the later car. And you can see those red things moving down. And what that's doing is that's enriching the mixture. And I'll explain exactly how it's doing that later, but I want to focus on the choke issue. So if you're not getting that movement out of the jets, you're not enriching the mixture, and you're having a problem starting the car. The other real issue with choke cables is that many of them today, well, most of them today, are reproductions. And you know, I'm not going to get into a big bashing session on all the stuff that's made overseas, but choke cables happen to be one of the things that are a problem. They're not made as well as they used to be. If you have a choke cable on your car, or have one on a parts car, and it appears to be an original style, salvage it if you can. You know, many of them get frayed at the end. All you got to do is shorten the outer casing and then shorten the inner cable, and you've got yourself a new choke cable. And the reason that it's important is because of the locking mechanism, and that is most of the cars you're pulling out the choke cable, and many of them you're pulling them out and turning the knob like a quarter of a turn, and that locks it in place. The problem is that oftentimes there's no indicator on there as to what is up. You know, what is the resting position? Some of them have a C on it, and then if it looks like a C, then you're in the right spot. You pull it out, you turn it, you know you're turned, and that tells you that you are in the locked position. But oftentimes it's carelessness that when it's out and people want to put it back in, they just push it back in without returning it to the moving position. So you got two positions. One is to just slide in and out nicely, and the other one is to lock it in place. And the way it locks is just a simple friction. You know, it's just a manufacturing tolerances within this shaft, and it's just a simple friction thing. So after a while, it's going to wear out, especially if you're abusing it by forcing it against the friction. So that's the biggest problem. So you pull it out and you turn it, and then when you're ready to push it in, you keep pushing it in and pushing it in without turning it, and eventually the locking mechanism is going to wear out, and it's not going to lock. So now you pull out the choke and it won't lock. You got to hold it. And you get one hand's on the choke, you're pulling it out. You're trying to start the car, and it's cumbersome and it's difficult. It shouldn't be difficult. It should be simple. The best choke cables are the late model MGB choke cables. It's a T-handle. I should have one here, but I don't. It's a T-handle. It's got a nice positive pull to it, and it locks. You know it's locked because it's vertical instead of horizontal, but it's not proper for all your cars. So unless, if you're a purist and you want the right cable, you can't use that. But if you don't care and you want a good cable, get the later MGB T-handle cables. So to prevent that from happening, when you're pulling out the choke, see, this is real easy for me. It's hard to illustrate, but this will come out real easy because that's the open position. And then if I turn it just slightly, it's locked in place. Now, as I'm pushing on this, it's not going in very easily. So that tells me it's locked. Don't keep pushing it because I'm just going to keep wearing. It'll go in, but you have to push it in. So you want to make sure you go back to the resting position and push it in that way. If you can master this, you'll solve a lot of your starting problems. And whenever I can, I get my hands on new old stock choke cables. I got a special parts bin in my parts room there with the original choke cables, and those are for special occasions when they're warranted. So that's the way the choke works. Related to that high idle that I talked about earlier, the high idle is one of the 3 adjustments that are on SUs. You've got the actual idle itself, which should be 800, 900, 1100, whatever you're comfortable with. Anything above 11 or 12 is a little excessive, and anything below 800 is probably ready to stall. There's no set in stone number. Whatever makes you feel comfortable, and it also has a lot to do with the tune of your engine. If you have a cam, it's got to be a little bit higher, just because the idles are rough. But there's the regular idle adjustment. There's the high idle adjustment, which is going to dictate what the idle is when that choke is pulled all the way out. And you don't want the thing racing like crazy. You just want enough of a high idle so that it's comfortable to take off from a stoplight with the engine cold and it doesn't bog down on you and stall. And then the third adjustment on these, of course, is the mixture. And that's a whole science in itself. And we can get I will get to that when I get into the tuning. So the fuel, real basic stuff here. The fuel is in the tank. You turn on the key. The fuel pump, electric fuel pump, starts pumping fuel through the lines and brings it into this. It enters in. It comes into this float bowl. This float bowl is just like the tank in the back of your toilet. There's a float in there, and when it reaches a certain level, the fuel, that float will stop, will close off a valve, and the idea is you want to maintain the same amount of fluid, of fuel in this as often as possible. You want to maintain that level, so the fuel level will go down, the carb will allow more fuel to enter, and you're maintaining a level. So what's inside of here? It's a little plastic float. On the earlier cars, Healey's and the TR3s and MGAs, it's this carb as I described to you earlier, and this has a brass float, and it just kind of floats around in there and maintains a certain level. So what's inside of this float bowl is typical of an old nasty carburetor. There's all sorts of crap in there. So if you have that stuff in there, that's a problem, and you have to clean it out. Why is it a problem? Because the float moving up and down is operating a needle and seat. It's a little sliding device that just allows fuel to either enter or not enter. Again, similar to a toilet bowl, if you can just envision that. It either allows fuel to come in or it doesn't allow the fuel to come in. What can go wrong is that this can stick. You get a piece of that dirt in there that we just took out of here, a little tiny piece of dirt in there, and it'll stick. It'll stick open, or it'll stick closed. If it sticks closed, you're not going to get any fuel in here. And then all of a sudden your car's going to start running and it just feels like crap because it's only running on one carburetor. The one carburetor isn't getting any fuel. Or it'll stick open, in which case the fuel will just keep pouring in. There's no stopping it, and it'll come out of the top of the float float bowl cover. it'll come out the top, and most of these are designed with an overflow tube, and the tube goes down and dumps the fuel on the ground. Hopefully it does that. If it's just open like this, it has free reign to go anywhere it wants, which is hopefully not onto your hot manifold. But if you're in a situation where fuel is just pouring out of the carburetor, you probably have a dirty or stuck needle and seat, and these are available for all the cars. You know, it's a simple change. Take off the top of the float bowl with the 3 screws, and this is the plastic float on the later cars. There's just a little rod here. It's just a press fit. This rod's, you slide this rod out, and underneath there is the needle in the seat. You take the old one out, put the new one in. You gotta make sure everything is clean, and put it all back together, and that should solve your problem. Over the years, with ethanol in the gasoline, and that's a whole subject that could take up a lot of time. It has a tendency to deteriorate the rubber parts in a lot of these carb rebuild kits. So Joe Curto's come out with Viton, a lot of Viton tip. This has the tip on it is Viton. A lot of the rubber parts are made out of a Viton. If anybody here knows exactly what Viton is, they can explain it to me, but I'm not really sure. But it's some kind of super duper material. It's not rubber, or it's half rubber and half something else. But if you have a Viton product, that's what you want.
Question?
Yeah.
Have you used the gross jets at all?
The gross jets were real big. I remember back in the 70s, you know, their slogan was great. The gross jet does the same. It does the same thing as this, but instead of it having a sliding piston that goes, a sliding little needle that meters up and down, there were 2 balls inside there. They're stationary. One's bigger than the other, and that stops the flow or allows the flow to come in. Gross jets, they're good. You know, they're okay. I don't use them just because I'm happy with these, but there's nothing wrong with gross jets. Just kind of an updated.
They work well?
Yeah, they work fine. Yep. Any questions?
The SU rebuild kits before had some of the needles had a nylon body, and I was having problems with them. The nylon body actually getting fatter from ethanol, and it was sticking.
Okay. Yeah, this is,
If
yeah.
anyone had those, and I got it from Jim Knight, and he got me the ones with the Viton.
Okay, exactly. You're right. The nylon bodies. You're right. This is all brass with the very tip of it, which is the real meat of it, is the Viton tip. So that is the fuel's coming in. It's going in here and it's resting in here, and you always have a supply of fuel in here. So now the fuel is going through this, which is the jet. It goes through this tube and up into the carburetor through this jet. And this is actually inside the carburetor like that. So when you look down the throat of the carb, you see the jet on the inside. What else can go wrong here is this is all nice, like a spring protected tube, but in essence it's really just a piece of I don't know whether it's nylon or just what it's made out of, but it's a flexible rubber hose like anything else that's covered with this protective spring. So you can't bite it and break it, but the elements can get to the inner hose just as easily as they could if it didn't have the outer protective coating. So you can spring a leak in here, inside here where it goes into the carburetor or into the float. This is a new one. Take this out. This is what a new one looks like, and if you'll see right here is a little black seal, and if that seal gets deteriorated enough, the fuel will start to drip out of your jet, out of the bottom of the float or along here, and so you need to replace the jet. Important when you replace these is when you take the old one off, oftentimes that little black seal is so corroded and so deteriorated that it's in there, and you don't even see it because it's half or a third of the size of what's on here. So you pop the new one in without taking the old one out, and you never get a good seal. So when you get this off, you got to take your dental pick that everybody has in their toolbox and pick away and make sure you got that out of there, so you get a good firm seal. Okay, so this is how the fuel gets to the body of the carburetor. I mentioned this little side note here. I mentioned this protective, this hose that's protected with this outer shield. it brings me to the subject of this type of fuel hose, which is common on these cars. It's the proper thing for many of the cars, you know, many of the Bs and Healey's. This is the proper stuff, and sometimes you have no choice. But I want everybody to keep in mind that just because it's fancy with the braiding on the outside doesn't mean that you know, you put it in once and you never have to do it again. Because inside of here is a piece of rubber hose, like any other piece of rubber hose. And the deterioration that takes place on that rubber hose, whether it's from the ethanol or from just the heat built up in the engine, is taking place on this rubber hose just as much as it is with the unprotected. So just because you have this doesn't mean you never have to change them. They get brittle just like all the other ones. So keep that in mind when you're reviewing your car and reviewing your situation. If this is old, it's been on there a real long time, get new ones, because as I said, it's just simple hose inside covered with a sheeting. All right, have I lost everybody yet? Everybody with me here? All right, trying to make it as this dull topic as interesting as possible. So the fuel is now ready. It's, by the way, if your float is adjusted properly, and there are specifications in your manual as to where this should be. You can see there's some play in here. I mean, this can go up or down, and there's a little tab here that you bend to adjust the height of the resting height. And there is a measurement that you should take into account when you're measuring this, so that ideally the level of the fuel in the float bowl is actually going to be equal on a plane to you know, you got the float bowl here and then the body of the carburetor, and if the level of the fuel is here, it needs to be here because the fuel is entering the carburetor right through the end of this jet, and it's kind of there in waiting. It's right at the top. It's right at the edge, because what's getting that fuel into the engine is the vacuum that's being created by the engine. And when you when you push down on the pedal and you open up the butterfly, you create this rush of air that flows into the carburetor, and that is pulling up that tiny level of fuel and bringing it into the car. So that's why the level of the fuel in the float is critical. Luckily, these aren't as precise as they sound, and it can be off a little bit. But this is all ideal. This is all under ideal situation. Ideal situation here would be that the float level is on the plane with that, and that's why you follow the instructions as to what the level should be. On the earlier cars, the brass float just kind of floats up and down, and there's a little fork on here that you bend to allow for the proper level on this as well. So with an understanding of how they work, and with my discussions today, hopefully you'll be able to take that and look at your manual and have a better understanding as to why things need to be the way they are, and follow on your own, and become a little bit more do-it-yourself as far as maintaining and understanding your carbs. So the carburetor, as I said, is waiting. It's got fuel just at the ready. You accelerate. You open up this the butterfly on the back, which creates this vacuum in through the face of the carburetor, and it pulls the fuel out of that jet that's waiting and mixes, and you got yourself a wonderful thing. The nice thing is that you can actually watch that. If you I'm always fascinated by it. If you got a car that's running and you got the air filters off, anytime you want to do any kind of carb work, it's always best to take the air filters off. You got a real view of everything that's going on. You can actually look down the throat of the carburetor, and you will see the fuel coming out of that orifice and atomizing, and it's a good way to tell, hey, this is working. And then you look at this carburetor, and all of a sudden, wow, there's nothing going on in there. So you can immediately tell where your problem is. But just a little bit of science there. It's kind of a neat thing to watch. The more vacuum that goes through, which is dictated by how much you open the throttle, the butterfly, the more vacuum that goes through, the higher this piston is going to raise. Okay? And this is getting a little technical, and certainly a little bit more technical than have the ability to explain, but there are various little holes and venturis in here, and the rushing of air through here causes this piston to raise or lower depending on how fast you're going. And what is that doing? Well, what that's doing is it's metering the amount of fuel that's getting into the engine. Okay, we've already talked about the needle and seat, which is just metering the amount of fuel that's being stored in the float, but now you have the actual needle, and this is what's allowing the correct amount of fuel into that particular engine, based on its design and this carburetor, and if you can't see it, it's tapered. And there are hundreds of different size needles for, hundreds of different applications, and